Something interesting just happened in the AV industry. And it didn't come from Tesla, BYD, or Washington. It came from Volvo's CEO, who made a surprisingly bold statement. He believes the United States is actually the perfect market for electric cars. And that raises a big question. If America is such an ideal place for EVs, why does adoption still feel so hesitant right now? Because the answer could shape the entire future of electrification in the US much faster than most. People expect. Welcome back to the EV News. You're quick, clear, audio-first update on everything happening in the electric vehicle world. Today we're looking at Volvo's latest comments on why the US should be leading the EV transition, not falling behind. And if you enjoy straightforward EV news and market context like this, consider subscribing. New stories are coming every week. Volvo's CEO, Con Samuelsson, was speaking during an event tied to the debut of the upcoming Volvo EX60, and during his briefing, he said something that caught a lot of attention. In his view, Americans should actually be more enthusiastic about electric vehicles than Europeans, not less. Samuelsson pointed to one very practical reason: the way Americans live. He said the US is a perfect market for electric cars because so many people live in suburbs, and many households have garages, sometimes even 3-car garages. In other words, home charging should be easier here than almost anywhere else. And from that perspective, he admitted he doesn't fully understand why Americans seem so negative or skeptical about EVs right now. And honestly, he has a point. When you look at the data, most Americans live in single-family homes. That means driveways, dedicated parking, and access to electricity right outside the door. Compare that with Europe, where a large share of the population lives in apartments or shared residential buildings. In the European Union, nearly half of citizens live in apartments, and many others live in buildings where private parking simply isn't guaranteed. If you're parking on the street, charging becomes a completely different challenge. You can't just plug in overnight. You're dependent on public chargers, curbside charging projects, or shared infrastructure. So in many ways, Europe has had to build an EV transition around public charging from the start, while the US has the potential to rely much more heavily on home charging. That difference alone makes Samuelsson's argument pretty compelling, but the bigger story here isn't just about garages. It's about the direction the EV transition is taking in the US compared to Europe and what happens next. Because right now, Europe and America seem to be moving in very different directions. European countries have generally stayed more committed to funding charging infrastructure. Climate policy is also less politically divisive there, which has allowed governments to push stricter emissions standards and longer-term electrification goals. The EU still wants a mostly carbon-free new car fleet by 2035, even if some targets have been softened or delayed. The direction is still clear. Electrification is the future, and policy is helping guide it. Meanwhile, in the United States, the situation feels murkier. Several automakers have recently shifted resources away from aggressive EV expansion and back toward gas-powered vehicles and hybrids. Federal incentives have changed. Regulations that once pushed the market toward lower emissions have been weakened or rolled back. And the overall national messaging around EVs has become far more mixed. That divergence has led some analysts to ask a serious question: could the US fall behind Europe in EV adoption? Samuelsson doesn't think so. In fact, he believes the US and Europe are more similar than they look right now. He argues that Americans are skeptical, partly because incentives have been reduced. But he doesn't believe incentives are what will ultimately drive the transformation. He thinks consumers. Well, and that's where this story becomes much more interesting, because one of the most consistent trends in the EV world is this: once people actually switch to electric, they rarely go back. EVs tend to win people over through daily experience, not politics. Range anxiety, for example, is one of the biggest fears among potential buyers. But most EV owners eventually realize that for normal daily driving, charging isn't the obstacle they imagined. In fact, charging at home becomes one of the biggest lifestyle advantages. You wake up with a full battery. You stop visiting gas stations. Maintenance is simpler. The driving experience is smoother, quieter, The driving experience is smoother, quieter. Quiet, and often faster. So Samuelson's argument is that the EV transition won't be powered by government programs forever. It will be powered by consumers realizing the product is simply better. Now, this is where we get to the real why this matters moment for the US EV market. Because if Volvo's CEO is right, then the American EV slowdown we're seeing right now may not be a long-term rejection. It may just be a temporary hesitation, a pause before the next wave. Think about what happened when Tesla cut prices dramatically in 2023. Demand surged. Competitors were forced to respond. And suddenly, EV pricing became the central battleground. Or look at what's happening now with more affordable models coming. Improvements in charging networks and automakers like GM, Ford, Hyundai, and Rivian preparing their next generation of AV platforms. The market isn't standing still. So what this could mean is that the US is still structurally positioned to electrify quickly, perhaps even faster than Europe. In some areas, once consumer confidence fully returns. And Volvo is clearly betting on that. The X60 debut is part of Volvo's broader push into a more electric future. And the company sees the US as a key battleground. If Americans truly have the home charging advantage Samuelson describes, then the US could become one of the strongest EV markets in the world, even without heavy incentives. That also has major implications for Tesla. Tesla's dominance has always been tied to the idea that EVs are not just cleaner but better products. If the broader market reaches that same consumer-driven tipping point, Tesla may face much stronger competition, but the entire EV category could grow faster. It also matters for companies like BYD, which is watching global expansion opportunities. And for legacy automakers like Ford and Volkswagen, who need the US market to remain viable for EV investment. So the big takeaway here is this. The US may feel skeptical today, but structurally, it might be one of the easiest places in the world to go electric. Home charging, suburban driving patterns, consumer experience, product advantages. Those factors don't disappear. The question is simply how long it takes for the market narrative to catch up with the reality of EV ownership. So the big question now is, are we about to see another major shift in EV adoption across the US, driven not by policy, but by consumers themselves? Let me know what you think. Is America truly the perfect EV market? Or are there bigger obstacles Volvo is underestimating? If you want to stay ahead of the EV revolution, subscribe to the EV News, and I'll see you in the next update.